Tommy "Iron Fist" Doyle was the man everyone in Liverpool feared, the kingpin who turned backstreet deals into a criminal empire. Until one rainy night, his body was found in the back of a black Mercedes, poisoned by someone close enough to shake his hand. In the late 1980s, Liverpool was a city caught in the grip of economic decline. The once busy docks, which had fueled generations of steady work, stood in eerie silence, their cranes frozen like metal skeletons against the gray skyline. Factories closed one after another, leaving thousands without jobs. Entire neighborhoods slipped into poverty, and the streets, once bustling with trade and chatter, became hunting grounds for petty thieves, hustlers, and gangs fighting over scraps. It was in these rough, forgotten corners that Tommy Doyle began his climb. Tommy was born into a working-class family in a part of the city where survival was the only ambition most people could afford. His father was a dock worker who drank too much, and his mother juggled multiple cleaning jobs to keep food on the table. From an early age, Tommy learned that rules were for people with something to lose, and he had nothing. By the time he was a teenager, he was running errands for local loan sharks, delivering messages that often came with broken windows or slashed tires. He wasn't big, but he was fearless, and that fearlessness was more valuable than muscle. His first real break came at 17, when he was sent to collect a debt from a man twice his size. The man laughed in his face, expecting the boy to back down. Instead, Tommy acted without hesitation, putting the man on the floor in seconds. Word of that incident spread quickly, and it marked him as someone who could be trusted to get a job done, no matter the risk. From that point on, he wasn't just an errand boy, he was an enforcer. The streets taught him fast. He understood that reputation was currency, and fear was the most reliable form of payment. He started dressing sharp, speaking less, and making sure every act of violence he committed was remembered. But he also knew when to be generous. He would help struggling shopkeepers by protecting them from other gangs, though of course they had to pay him for that protection. It wasn't just about intimidation, it was about creating a network of people who owed him favors, people who would keep quiet when the police came asking questions. Liverpool in those years was fertile ground for someone like Tommy. With unemployment at record highs, young men were desperate for a way out of poverty. And Tommy offered them not just money, but a sense of belonging. He handpicked his crew, favoring loyalty over experience. Some were former boxers, others petty thieves, and a few were childhood friends who trusted him completely. Together they began to control the backstreets, gambling dens, stolen car operations and small-time drug deals, all under Tommy's command. By 25, he had risen from a boy with nothing to a man who could walk into any pub in the city and command silence. The police knew his name, but he was always one step ahead, using fear, favors, and the loyalty of his crew to keep himself untouchable. In the eyes of the people living in Liverpool's toughest neighborhoods, Tommy Doyle wasn't just another gangster, he was the man who ruled the streets. Tommy Doyle's rise from a feared street enforcer to the undisputed power in Liverpool's underworld did not happen overnight. It took calculation, patience, and a ruthless understanding of human nature. By the mid-1990s he had already built a solid base of influence, but he knew that small-time operations would never make him untouchable. His ambition was bigger than just controlling a few backstreets. He wanted an empire that stretched across the city, with money flowing in from every corner, and for that he needed to expand his reach into the most profitable and dangerous trade. Drugs were the heartbeat of the criminal economy at the time, and Tommy moved in with precision. Instead of muscling his way in recklessly, he used charm and strategy, forging alliances with suppliers who valued stability over chaos. He positioned himself as the man who could keep the police at bay and ensure deliveries moved without interruption. Within a few years, cocaine and heroin shipments began flowing through routes he controlled, hidden among legitimate cargo or smuggled in through fishing boats docked along the Mersey. Every gram sold in certain neighborhoods meant a cut for Tommy, and his profits multiplied at an astonishing rate. But he didn't stop there. He understood the value of diversifying. His network began smuggling stolen electronics, counterfeit designer clothes, and luxury cars stripped for parts. Illegal gambling dens flourished under his protection, some hidden behind the facade of social clubs or boxing gyms. Every operation was layered with secrecy, making it almost impossible for outsiders to connect the dots. The people who worked for him were bound by loyalty, fear, or a combination of both. Breaking that loyalty wasn't just dangerous, it was fatal. Tommy also knew how to control his public image. He kept a low profile, rarely appearing in photographs, and when he did, he was just another face in a crowded pub. He didn't flaunt wealth in a way that would attract unnecessary attention, but those close to him saw the expensive suits, the imported cars, and the discreet meetings in private dining rooms. His money was invested in legitimate businesses, taxi companies, property rentals, even a small shipping firm, laundering his profits and giving him the appearance of a respectable businessman. The police were aware of his growing influence, but case after case fell apart in court. Witnesses vanished, either persuaded with cash or silenced through more permanent means. Evidence seemed to evaporate before it could be used. Rumors swirled of corrupt officials in his pocket, though nothing was ever proven. For the ordinary people of Liverpool's roughest neighborhoods, Tommy became a shadowy figure of power. Someone who could make problems disappear, but also someone you never wanted to cross. By the time the millennium arrived, Tommy's operations stretched far beyond the city. His reach extended into Manchester, Birmingham, and even London, where his influence was felt in certain criminal circles. The man who had once been just a boy running errands for loan sharks now commanded a criminal empire that generated millions. Liverpool was no longer just his home, it was his kingdom, and every street within it paid tribute to the king. The first signs of trouble came quietly. A few of Tommy Doyle's trusted couriers began reporting unusual activity along his supply routes. Cars tailing them for miles, unfamiliar faces loitering near drop points, and shipments delayed without explanation. At first Tommy suspected police interference, but soon the truth became clear. A powerful gang from Manchester had set its sights on Liverpool's lucrative drug market. They were younger, hungrier, and willing to take risks that others avoided. Instead of negotiating, they moved in aggressively, undercutting prices, bribing Tommy's suppliers, and spreading whispers that the city's so-called king was losing his grip. For months, the tension simmered under the surface. Neither side wanted a public war that would bring heavy police attention, but the streets had a way of forcing confrontations. It began with vandalism. Warehouses linked to Tommy torched in the dead of night, cars belonging to his lieutenants found burnt out in alleyways. The message was clear. This was more than business. It was a direct challenge to his authority. Tommy responded in the way only he knew: quiet, calculated, and devastating. His men tracked the Manchester crew's movements with precision, learning their routines and identifying their weak spots. When the first counterattack came, it was swift and untraceable. A rival stash house was raided in the early hours, its contents stolen or destroyed. Days later, 2 key members of the invading gang vanished without a trace. On the streets, it was understood they would never be seen again. As the months dragged on, the violence escalated. Bodies began appearing in the River Mersey, weighed down so they would surface days later, a grim warning to anyone thinking of siding with Manchester. Shootings erupted in the quiet backstreets of Toxteth and Kirkdale, often late at night, with no witnesses willing to speak. The city's residents learned to keep their heads down and their mouths shut. The police increased patrols, but they were chasing shadows. Every lead ended in silence. Every trail went cold. Despite the chaos, Tommy maintained an outward calm. To his crew, this was a test of loyalty, and those who hesitated were quickly removed from his circle. He began rewarding his most trusted men with larger cuts and more responsibility, ensuring that his inner circle was tighter than ever. Yet behind the scenes he was ruthless. Informants were rooted out and dealt with brutally, and anyone suspected of feeding information to the enemy was gone within days. By the end of the year, the Manchester gang's presence in Liverpool had withered. Some returned home, beaten and humiliated, while others simply disappeared from the criminal map entirely. No one knew exactly how many lives were taken in that silent war, but those who lived through it agreed that the streets had never been bloodier. The message was now carved deep into the city's memory. Tommy Doyle was not just a man who ran Liverpool, he was someone you could challenge only once. By the early 2000s, Tommy Doyle had become something more than just a gangster, was a myth. In the eyes of Liverpool's underworld, he had crossed the line from feared street boss to untouchable kingpin. His public appearances were rare, and when they happened, they were choreographed with precision. He would arrive at certain pubs or private clubs with a small team of bodyguards, stay no more than an hour, and leave without drawing attention from outsiders. People whispered about his movements, but few actually saw him up close. To most of the city, Tommy existed in the shadows, his influence felt everywhere but his face rarely seen. Part of his strength came from the network he had built. His crew was no longer just local enforcers, it now included accountants, lawyers, and businessmen who had their own reasons for protecting him. Front companies masked his illegal earnings, allowing him to funnel money into legitimate ventures, property development, import-export businesses, and high-end restaurants. Each one gave him both a steady flow of clean income and a respectable public cover. If questioned, Tommy was simply a successful entrepreneur who had risen from nothing. Police surveillance was constant, but frustratingly unproductive. Undercover officers tried to infiltrate his network, only to be spotted and shut out within weeks. Wiretaps picked up conversations so vague that prosecutors couldn't make a case. On paper, Tommy was clean. The few times he was brought into a police station, he left without charge, often smiling faintly as if amused by the attempt. Some suspected corruption within the force. How else could he walk away so easily, when so many knew what he was? But even if certain officers were in his pocket, proving it was impossible. Tommy's control wasn't maintained by fear alone. He practiced a careful balance of intimidation and generosity. In the neighborhoods under his influence, families struggling to pay bills might find an envelope of cash slipped through their letterbox. Local youth clubs received anonymous donations, and funeral expenses for certain residents were mysteriously covered. Acts like these weren't charity, they were investments. Those who benefited would never speak against him, and many became his eyes and ears on the street. Still, his power was not without its costs. He lived under constant security, rarely traveling without at least 2 armed men by his side. His homes were fortified with reinforced doors, surveillance cameras, and guard dogs. Paranoia was part of his daily life, though he would never admit it openly. The more territory he controlled, the more enemies he quietly made. Over time, the myth of Tommy Doyle grew larger than the man himself. Young criminals idolized him, seeing him as proof that the streets could make you rich and untouchable. Older figures in the underworld respected his discipline, even if they didn't like him. For over a decade, no one dared to make a direct move against him. He had created a fortress of influence, one that seemed impenetrable. But what no one knew then was that the cracks were already forming, and they were coming from the inside. Power never stays perfectly balanced, and in Tommy Doyle's empire, the first signs of instability came quietly, almost invisibly. At first, they were dismissed as small problems, minor disputes between crew members, late deliveries, or whispers about missed payments. But beneath the surface, resentment was growing. Tommy had built his kingdom on loyalty, yet the new generation of criminals emerging in Liverpool saw loyalty differently. To them, the old code of respect and secrecy was outdated. They valued quick money, flashy displays of wealth, and taking risks that Tommy would have considered reckless. For years, Tommy had kept tight control over operations, making final decisions on everything from drug prices to who could be trusted with certain routes. Younger members began to chafe under that control, frustrated that opportunities for faster expansion were being blocked by what they saw as outdated caution. Some felt they could earn more by cutting deals with outside gangs, and they didn't understand why Tommy insisted on maintaining certain alliances that seemed to bring little profit. His careful, methodical approach, which had once kept everyone safe, was now seen by a few as a weakness. Rumors started to circulate about secret meetings. These weren't large gatherings, but quiet conversations in bars, gyms, and late-night car parks. Tommy's lieutenants, men who had been with him for years, noticed the subtle shifts in loyalty. Certain orders were followed more slowly. Deliveries were rerouted without explanation. And though no one dared challenge Tommy directly, the sense of absolute control he once enjoyed was beginning to slip. At the same time, rival crews were testing the edges of his territory. Smaller gangs, emboldened by the belief that Tommy's reign was softening, began to push into areas he had long dominated. Normally, such moves would have been met with immediate, decisive retaliation, but now, his responses were slower. He was selective about where to strike, preferring to avoid drawing police attention during a time when surveillance was already heavy. To some in his circle, this caution looked like hesitation. Even his most loyal men began to feel uneasy. They could sense the shift in the atmosphere, the way conversations stopped when certain people entered the room, the way long-trusted allies now spoke in guarded tones. Money was still flowing, but it no longer felt as secure. Old enemies were resurfacing, and new ones were being created within his own ranks. Tommy noticed the change, but underestimated how deep it ran. He still believed fear and loyalty would hold his empire together, as they always had. What he didn't see was that the same qualities that had kept him untouchable for so long, his strict control, his calculated patience, were now driving some of his closest allies toward betrayal. By the time he realized how fragile the foundation had become, it was already too late. The cracks in his armor were no longer hairline fractures, they were widening gaps, and the danger wasn't coming from rival cities or police investigations. It was coming from the very people he had trusted to protect him. The night Tommy Doyle died was one of those cold, wet evenings when Liverpool seemed to swallow sound. Rain fell in steady sheets, tapping against the docks and pooling in the potholes of deserted streets. The air smelled of salt and rust, and the city's industrial skeleton loomed under the dim glow of scattered streetlights. Tommy's black Mercedes was parked in an isolated corner of the dockyard, a place he had often used for discreet meetings away from curious eyes. From the outside, nothing seemed unusual. The car was locked, the engine off, and the windows misted slightly from the damp air. When the dockworker found him in the early hours, the sight was unsettling in its stillness. Tommy sat in the back seat, leaning slightly to one side, his face calm, almost peaceful. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, no shattered glass or forced entry. His wallet and phone were still in place, his watch still on his wrist. To anyone passing by, it could have looked as if he had simply fallen asleep. But the moment the police arrived, it was clear this was no natural death. The post-mortem report revealed something chilling. Tommy had been poisoned with a rare compound, one so uncommon that toxicologists struggled to identify it. It was colorless, tasteless, and nearly undetectable in food or drink. This wasn't the work of an amateur. It required precision, access, and planning. Whoever had done this hadn't just wanted Tommy gone. They had wanted him to disappear without spectacle, leaving no messy scenes or public gunfights. It was an execution hidden in plain sight. Detectives retraced his last movements, piecing together the final hours. CCTV showed his car arriving at the dockyard just after 9 p.m. and remaining there until it was discovered in the morning. No one else appeared on camera entering or leaving the vehicle, and the nearest cameras to the water's edge were conveniently out of order. Whoever set this in motion had either tampered with the surveillance or chosen the spot knowing the blind spots by heart. There was speculation about why Tommy had been there at all. Some believed he had arranged a meeting with a trusted associate, someone who could get close enough to poison his drink without raising suspicion. Others whispered about a trap. Perhaps he had been lured there under false pretenses, believing he was handling a problem in his network. But the lack of evidence made every theory feel like guesswork. In the days that followed, the city's underworld was gripped by an eerie quiet. No revenge killings erupted. No public threats were made. Instead, there was a heavy, watchful silence, as if everyone knew the killer was still close and still untouchable. For decades, Tommy had been the man who controlled Liverpool's streets. On that rainy November night, he had stepped into the dockyard as the king of the city and left it as a body in the back seat of a car, betrayed by someone he never saw coming. In the immediate days after Tommy Doyle's death, Liverpool's underworld felt like it had been placed under a glass dome. The usual sounds of the city's criminal heartbeat, late-night car engines, muffled shouts in back alleys, the clink of bottles in dimly lit bars, were replaced by an unnatural stillness. Word of his murder spread fast, but it was carried in whispers, never in bold statements. No one wanted to be overheard discussing who might have had the power or courage to kill him. In a world where even casual speculation could be fatal, silence became the safest currency. Police swarmed his known haunts, conducting raids on properties, businesses, and suspected stash houses. Uniformed bosses and detectives in plain clothes seemed to be everywhere, kicking in doors at dawn, hauling away files, computers, and bags of cash. Yet, for all the noise and movement, nothing solid emerged. The poison used was almost impossible to trace, and without a clear suspect, the investigation stalled before it could even gather momentum. Publicly, the case was still open. Privately, many officers admitted it was unlikely to ever be solved. Inside the network Tommy had built, fear replaced the old sense of order. His closest lieutenants, men who had once been confident in his protection, began disappearing one by one. Some were found in shallow graves on the outskirts of the city. Others simply vanished, their flats left untouched as if they had walked out for a pint and never returned. Those who remained kept their heads down, avoiding their usual pubs, ignoring phone calls from unfamiliar numbers, and cutting ties with anyone they didn't fully trust. The vacuum left by Tommy's death was enormous, and rival groups wasted no time testing the boundaries. Smaller gangs moved into key territories, offering cheaper drugs, undercutting protection fees, and spreading the idea that the Doyle era was over for good. There were small flare-ups of violence, but they were calculated, never enough to draw the kind of attention Tommy's wars had once attracted. It was as if the city's criminals were collectively waiting, trying to see if someone would step up to take his place, or if the man responsible for killing him would make himself known. Theories about the killer multiplied in the shadows. Some swore it was a rival from outside Liverpool who had finally found a way to reach him without starting a bloodbath. Others believed the poison could only have come from inside his own circle, from someone who had been close enough to earn his trust, to share a meal or a drink without suspicion. The most unsettling theory was that it had been a joint effort, a quiet agreement among his own men to remove him before his grip on the city slipped any further. Months passed, and the city adapted to life without its most feared figure. The fear he once commanded didn't vanish, it simply shifted, attaching itself to the uncertainty of who might be pulling the strings now. For the people who had lived under Tommy Doyle's rule, his murder wasn't closure, it was a warning that in Liverpool's underworld, kings could fall overnight, and their killers could walk the streets unseen. Years after Tommy Doyle's death, his name still lingered in Liverpool like a ghost that refused to be buried. In the neighborhoods he once ruled, people spoke of him in the same hushed tones they had used when he was alive, glancing over their shoulders as if the mere act of mentioning him might invite trouble. Time had dulled the immediate shock, but it had not erased the fear or the fascination. His story had become part of the city's folklore, a cautionary tale and a badge of dark pride all at once. The territories he controlled never returned to the same level of order. After his death, they were carved up among smaller, more volatile gangs, each lacking the discipline and calculated restraint that Tommy had enforced. Drug prices fluctuated wildly, turf disputes erupted without warning, and violence became more unpredictable. Without a single figure at the top, the underworld fractured into a dozen competing pieces, none of which could match the efficiency of his reign. For many, the chaos was proof that for all his ruthlessness, Tommy had kept the streets under a strange kind of control. Murals began to appear on brick walls and underpasses, some portraying him in sharp suits with a cold, unreadable stare, others depicting him as a local hero standing against faceless enemies. These images would be painted overnight, sometimes staying for weeks before being covered in fresh paint by the council, only to reappear in another part of the city days later. No one admitted to creating them, but their persistence suggested an organized effort by those who still felt loyalty to his memory. Stories about his last night took on an almost mythical quality. Some claimed he had known he was walking into a trap but had gone anyway, choosing to face his fate on his own terms. Others whispered about a coded message hidden in the location where he was found, as if he had left a final clue to those who understood his methods. None of these theories could be proven, but they kept the mystery alive, ensuring that his death was never just another gangland killing. For young criminals coming up in the city, Tommy's name was both inspiration and warning. They admired the way he had risen from nothing, the iron control he had maintained for decades, and the fortune he had amassed. But they also saw the price living in constant paranoia, trusting no one fully, and meeting an end that came not in a blaze of glory but in the quiet betrayal of poisoned blood. In the police archives, his case remained marked as unsolved, a file thick with reports, interviews and dead-end leads. Detectives who had worked it still referred to him as the one that got away, both in life and in death. And so his legend endured, not just as a story of power and violence, but as a reminder that in Liverpool's criminal underworld, no man, no matter how feared, was truly untouchable. His shadow still moved through the city's alleys, in the spaces between truth and myth, where fear and respect blurred into the same thing.